All right, well, we are at the top of the hour, so I just want to welcome everybody um, to the Center for Biological Diversity's quarterly biodiversity briefing. We're so glad to have you here. I'm Paula Simmons, Chief Development Officer, and we're joined by Kieran Suckling, the center's Executive Director. Before starting, we just want to share our appreciation for your powerful support, and all of you on this call have just made such a great difference in our work. It's your passion and your Center's life-saving work in conjunction with our shared mission of a wild planet that makes what we do possible. And it's so truly appreciated. So thanks again so much. Today, Kieran is going to be discussing the countless number of species and critical habitats the center's working to protect. And our efforts in the last 6 months, despite the fact that we have a new administration, have only accelerated. In fact, we're in court right now to secure Endangered Species Act protections for more than 50 different species. And of course, in this presentation, we'll be highlighting the center's strategy and petitions and all our hard and fierce work to protect our beloved gray wolves. But first, we just need to review a couple of technical details regarding the presentation. During Kieran's talk, you'll be muted to cut down on any background noise. We'll turn audio back on for you during the Q&A, and today's call, you may have noticed, is being recorded. So that gives us the ability to email you a recording within the next few days. And again, I just want to thank all of you for being on the call today. And now I'll turn it over to you, Kieran.
Thanks, Paula. We're in a new era now, of the Biden era. And that's certainly a relief. And I know endangered species are also feeling a relief from the onslaughts we suffered in the last 4 years. But while things are quite a bit better now, we've still got a tremendous amount of work to do. And that's work partly cleaning up the Trump disasters that are still out there. And secondly, advancing new endangered species protection agendas, but then also responding to things from the Biden administration that we don't like, because he's clearly not going to do everything we want to do, and he's going to be under tremendous pressure to not do a lot of important things he needs to do, that he's legally required to do. So I'm not going to talk about all of the center's work in the last 6 months. I'm going to focus on endangered species oriented issues. And I'm going to talk about winning legal protections for species first, that is getting them placed onto the endangered species list. And then I'll talk about projects to use those protections afterwards to protect the species habitat, stop them from being killed, and put them on a road to recovery. So this is a picture of the Humboldt martin, a tiny little cat-sized predator. Used to occur widely in old-growth forests on the West Coast, but now is limited to just a very few populations in Oregon and California. The center's been working to get it legal protection under the Endangered Species Act for a number of years. And the Biden administration just did that and put it onto the endangered species list. And so from this point forward, we have much more powerful tools now to protect it and its habitat so that it can recover. This is the island marble, beautiful butterfly, once thought extinct until rediscovered in the San Juan Islands off the coast of Northwest Washington State. We petitioned to list it as an endangered species quite a while ago, I want to say 10 years or more, and have been battling through bureaucratic delays to get it finally protected, and we did so just a few weeks ago. It's down to about 200 individual butterflies left on Lopez Island and on San Juan. threatened by habitat destruction, suburban sprawl, and pesticide spraying. And here's another small fisher, a bit bigger than the Humboldt martin, the southern Sierra Nevada fisher. It's threatened by climate change, by logging of its old-growth forest, fragmentation by housing developments in the southern Sierra Nevada. Its range is from Yosemite southward. And also rodenticides. Almost all of the mammalian predators, large and small, from wolves to fishers, foxes, martins, have been poisoned by rodenticides. And these poisons are not targeted at them. So what's happening is homeowners are using next generation rodenticides to kill rats and mice around their house, and then these escape into the forest. They're eaten by predators, and then the predators end up being poisoned as well. It's a huge problem, and it's one that's been exacerbated by illegal pot farms in the national forest, especially in California. Because there you're right in the national forest with pretty intensive spreading of rodenticides to protect the pot plant. So hopefully with the legalization of marijuana, we'll see a big decrease in the illegal wildland marijuana plantations, have those agricultural fields move back toward the urban and suburban zone and be environmentally regulated instead of being wildcat. But we'll see how that plays out. This is a very interesting creature, the Missouri eastern hellbender. It's an enormous salamander. Can grow 2 to 3 feet in length. And there's a number of hellbenders on the East Coast, subspecies and populations that are threatened by water pollution and dams primarily. We've been working to get them protected. This particular one that got listed as endangered only occurs in Missouri. This is the eastern black rail. It's a fuzzy picture because virtually all pictures of it are fuzzy. It's a very cryptic species, very hard to find. It lives in densely vegetated wetlands on the East Coast. And so it's very hard to get in to find it. By the time you get there, you make a bunch of noise. So it takes off. It's a very shy species, but it's declined and become endangered on the East Coast due to the draining of wetlands. And it's going to require some very significant and targeted wetland restoration to bring it back. And here is the Carolina mad tom, beautiful fish. It is one of many fish, but also many mussels, crayfish, endangered in southeastern rivers because they have been so polluted, so impacted by coal mining, by dams. And that area of the Southeast has simply not received the level of attention or funding that the rest of the country has. So we've got this really acute extinction crisis going on in the Southeast that needs much more attention and conservation effort than it's getting. So getting the mad tom onto endangered species list should help with that. And here is the unassuming beardless chinchweed. This is a plant that grows in southern Arizona, and the center does a tremendous amount of work on plants. You don't hear about it as much. The media is not so interested in plants and small species, but we certainly are. This one occurs up around the proposed Rosemont mine in southern Arizona, which is a mine we've been fighting for years now. The mine's on its deathbed already. And so we're hoping that the listing of this plant as endangered will help push it over the edge and have that project disappear forever. The Sierra Nevada red fox, another medium-sized predator that occurs throughout the Sierra Nevada in California, threatened tremendously by climate change. It really needs cold, snowy climate to survive, and those winters are becoming shorter and shorter, the snow depth less and less. Also threatened by logging and sprawl in the Sierra Nevadas. And and if you see a pattern with these medium-sized predators getting listed now, that is a real pattern. The federal government started its predator work with the large predators: wolves, grizzly bears, jaguars, lynxes, and they got the initial attention, the initial funding. They were well studied because they're big, they're charismatic, they're wide-ranging. So we had good information on them. These smaller predators just didn't get as much conservation funding, so there wasn't as much information about them. And it took longer for us to be able to document their status well enough to be able to get them listed as endangered species. But that's something that's really starting to happen now in the last 6 months. It's the Hermes copper butterfly in Southern California. It's been proposed for listing, so not listed yet. And it is threatened by suburban sprawl, by fire and disturbed ecosystems in the chaparral there, and pesticide spraying. And the Mount Rainier white-tailed ptarmigan. So ptarmigan are these very high elevation birds, somewhat like grouse, and they occur in mountain peaks from Colorado up through Alaska. They're very threatened by climate change because they do occur on these mountaintops with nowhere to go as it gets warm. They're not strong flyers that can just move vast distances. But they're overall really poorly studied. So even though we know that a lot of them are declining, the data is not really there to be able to demonstrate that with sufficient confidence to get them listed as endangered. But this population on Mount Rainier outside of Seattle is pretty well studied. And it's now been proposed for Endangered Species Act listing by the Biden administration. And then the lesser prairie chicken. This is a species we've been fighting over for many, many years. It's gone through many rounds of being put forward for listing, have the agency delay or have the agency issue a negative finding or refusal to protect it, and we sue and we get it overturned. So it's been proposed now, finally, and hopefully we'll get a final rule protecting it in about a year or so. But there will be tremendous pressure by the oil and gas industry to prevent that from happening. So it will be a good test of whether the Biden administration is willing and able to stand up to them as it needs to. So moving on to talk about recovery efforts. So this is the jaguar, who was listed as endangered in 1997, and it barely occurs in the US anymore. It formerly did, from Monterey Bay, across California, Arizona, Grand Canyon, southern Colorado, and sort of down to southern Louisiana. But for the past few decades, the only presence in the US has been 1 or 2 males at a time in southern Arizona or southern New Mexico. And it seems like they're coming up here from a population about 200 miles south of the border. And they're looking to establish new territories in the US. They're looking to find females, but there are no females here. And so their ability to naturally recolonize the US is very limited. And if it does happen, it could take a very long time, 50 years, 100 years. And of course, during that time, its ability to migrate across the border and up is going to get more and more difficult with walls and highways and so forth. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service now, through multiple presidential administrations, Democrat and Republican, has really tried to just wash its hands of the species. It fought the listing, we forced it to do so. It fought the designation of critical habitat areas for it, and we forced it to do so. It refused to do a recovery plan until we forced it to do so. And it would like just for the jaguar to go away and for all conservation efforts to occur south of the U.S. It's got a big range south of the U.S. But we and others have been pushing to have substantial recovery efforts here in the U.S. And we think they're necessary for not just because the law requires it, which it does, but because of climate change, jaguars are going to be increasingly moving north. And so just because the U.S. is at the northern end of its range is not a reason to dismiss it. In fact, it's a very important place for jaguars to be. So this year, we and a host of very prominent jaguar scientists published a study looking at habitat throughout New Mexico and Arizona for the jaguar, and doing a lot of complex analyses to show that it is recoverable. It can be reintroduced here, and we need to reintroduce it. We can't wait for natural colonization to occur. So this will be the beginning of a multi-year effort, which we hope someday will result in jaguars being brought up from Mexico and introduced into the Southwest. This is a snowy plover at one of its important habitat sites, the Oceana Dunes in California, and it nests right on the dunes on the beach next to the water, and that's a very prime real estate. A lot of folks want to be right at the water. In fact, if we zoom out from this very picture, what we see is that this bird narrowly missed getting run over by ORVs. And ORV traffic is very, very heavy in the Oceana Dunes. This is what it looks like much of the year. You can imagine how difficult it would be for snowy plovers and other beach species to successfully nest, raise their young in this kind of traffic. It's amazing that they still do, which they do. They're there on the site. So they're very, very tenacious, but there's just limits to what any population can do. So we have been pushing through litigation, through political efforts to get the ORVs taken off the dunes, or at least the important parts of the dunes where the plover population can grow. And this year we've been quite successful. There is a coastal commission, it's a very powerful agency in California. And it came out very recently and said that off-roading's got to end in most of the Oceana Dunes to save the species and to restore the beach. And that decision will take about 3 years before it will actually be implemented. So giving people time to change and find other places to go. But that will be a very enormous contribution to the recovery of the plover and a lot of other species as well. This is the Pacific walrus, and it's one of a number of Alaskan species that the center has sought endangered species protection for due to climate change, and most especially the loss of sea ice. And so we got the polar bear listed as endangered, as threatened rather, in 2008. Also some ice seals. But the agency has refused to list the walrus as endangered, even though it clearly is, and for the very same reasons as the polar bear. So we went to court. We sued them over their refusal. We said that they got the science wrong. And we recently, in the Court of Appeals, just won a great victory, striking down Trump's refusal to protect the species under the Endangered Species Act. Now, that doesn't put it on the act right away. All it says is your refusal is struck down. You got to go back, make a new decision. And so now that new decision will be made by the Biden administration. So that will be an early and important test of the Biden administration's willingness to take on climate change, push back against pressure from the state of Alaska, and listen to what the scientists are saying about this species. So look to hear more on that over the next year or so. And so this is a picture of the Front Range in Montana. So that's the sort of foothills and low mountains on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. Very beautiful rolling grassland country. And this is how we often think of it. It's how we like to see it. But unfortunately, a lot of that country looks more like this. The proliferation of oil and gas drilling platforms throughout the Front Range in Wyoming and Montana has just been devastating. It covers enormous acres and it pollutes the groundwater, it pollutes the air terribly. There are many places now in rural, very rural Montana and Wyoming that have some of the worst air quality in the entire country because of the fossil fuel emissions coming from these drilling platforms. It's a real disaster. And it's something that has to stop, both for the climate and for wildlife. This is the sage grouse, an endangered species, imperiled species that lives up in that area. And it cannot survive near these oil derricks because predators get up on them, use that platform to hunt the grouse from, and the grouse know this, so they move out of an area as soon as they see these derricks come in. So it's one of the major threats to the grouse, and we and others have been fighting for 20 plus years now to get the grouse protected, to get adequate plans set up to protect them on BLM lands, national forest lands, state lands, throughout the whole interior West. And they're going to be ongoing because the Trump administration rolled back a lot of the plans that were put in place by Obama. Those plans weren't, in our opinion, adequate regardless, but they were a lot better than the status quo, and now those have been rolled back. And so we're fighting to change that. And then meanwhile, on that front, we just had a real significant victory in the last few weeks where we filed a lawsuit over oil leasing on public lands on about 630 square miles of land in Montana and Wyoming, and won that case. Protected that land for the sage grouse. And then the gray wolf. The center spends a lot of energy trying to protect gray wolves, but also red wolves on the East Coast as well. We're working on all the populations in the US. And they have, in the northern part of the range, northern Rockies, they've been taken off the endangered species list. And that was done so in a deal with the states, that the states would manage the populations at high enough population levels to satisfy the US Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, we very much disagreed with this deal. We thought that the agreed upon levels were just too low. And we've been fighting with the Fish and Wildlife Service over that. But once Trump came into office, the states there realized that Trump would let them do whatever they want. And so they violated these agreements. Their legislatures have passed laws to dramatically reduce the number of wolves back down to the point where they'd be endangered again and allow massive slaughter of wolves. So we and other conservation groups are now going back to the Fish and Wildlife Service and saying that they need to relist the wolves, even under their own flawed plan. What the states are doing clears a violation of that plan, and therefore invalidates the grounds for taking them off the endangered species list. So we're hoping that this effort over the next couple of years will result in the wolf being put back on to the federal endangered species list, and or having these state laws overturned as being just too controversial and just completely out of sync with what people want in these regions. And, I've been talking about so far about work on particular species, which is very critical stuff. But the Trump administration also changed a suite of broad endangered species policies that applied to all 1,800 species on the federal endangered species list. And so getting those Trump policies reversed has been a very big agenda of ours. We've been in court over that, going back to when Trump was president. But nicely, while that was working its way through the court, the Biden administration just came out very recently and said it's going to reverse those policies itself. So that's a big victory. There's a whole bunch of those policies. I won't go through them all, but I'll just give you one example. Prior to Trump, whenever a species was listed as threatened or endangered, it automatically triggered a prohibition of killing or harming the species, because listed as threatened or endangered, surely the first thing you have to do is no longer kill it. And Trump administration, though, stopped doing that. And it said, okay, we'll do it for endangered species because the law is very clear about that. We don't have a choice, but we're going to exploit a loophole in the law and say we're not going to institute that for anything listed as threatened, which is about half of the 1,800 species. So now they're listed, they're protected, except you can still go out and kill them because it's not illegal. And then the agency went on to say, now, if Fish and Wildlife wishes to prohibit the killing of the species, it would need to then go and issue a separate rule, separate policy for each and every species. So this would take years upon years of work. It's been millions of dollars. It would divert the agency when this can be done and has always been done in mass as a matter of policy. And so that was struck down. So henceforth, going forward with this administration, all species will be protected from killing as soon as they are listed. So there's a lot more I could talk about. The center has an enormous number of projects going on, but it kind of gives you a sense of the work and what it looks like now under the Biden administration. So perhaps we should just open it up for questions then.
Yeah, wow. Thanks so much, Kieran, for that super presentation on our work protecting wildlife under the Biden administration. So like Kieran said, we're going to open up the Q&A now. And so this is an opportunity for you to ask any live questions that you have directly to Kieran. And there's a couple of ways that you can do that. If you're on the Zoom presentation, you can just signal that you'd like to ask a question just by finding that little raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And then we will unmute you. And if you've joined us by phone instead and you would like to ask a question, you just need to first press *9 and let us know that you're interested in asking. And then either Laura or one of us on our team here will unmute you. And then you can press *6 and you'll be able to speak. So press *9 to raise your hand on the phone and then press *6. You're also welcome to put any questions that you have into the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, or you can just good old fashioned email us live right now at questions@biologicaldiversity.org. We'll receive those emails live and we'll try to work those questions in as well if we have time. And when you do ask a question, we just ask that you please share with us your name and where you're calling from, because we just like to hear where your folks are from, and we so appreciate all of you. So with that, please let us know any questions that you have for Kieran. Maybe I'll just go ahead and read this first one here. I just, for time. So we have Evelyn Mertz who's written in, and she says, what effect will increasing drought due to climate change have on the reintroduction of the jaguar? Should water be provided? And Evelyn is calling in or writing in from Houston.
Yeah, so drought is a major problem for many endangered species throughout the West, really throughout the whole country. And it's going to be a huge challenge going forward, and this includes, of course, all the aquatic species like the fish, but even more so forest-dependent species. It's not, though, happily a great threat to the jaguar. The jaguar is very much a habitat generalist. As long as it's got a prey base available to it, it'll do okay. And so we've got good populations of deer and javelina in the lower elevation forests and high desert in this region, then elk further up. And those species also aren't super water dependent. So drought isn't going to be a limitation for that introduction, but as I mentioned earlier, it's a severe threat to many other endangered species, and one of the reasons why we really need to get climate change under control.
Laura, do you want to read any of the other questions, or is there anybody else who's waiting?
Yes, we do have Rebecca waiting, and I'll go ahead and allow you to unmute now, Rebecca.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I live on the coast in Oregon. There's a lot of issues here around because we've been having fires like California, but the impact that has with our logging industry here, who wants to do a lot of clearing in those burned areas. And I'm wondering what impact that has in terms of the species that are there that have already, a lot of habitat has been lost.
Yeah, it's a huge problem for endangered species, for soil erosion, for streams, for the whole ecosystem when they go in after a fire, then to log the burned trees. It's like mugging a burn victim. It's just not what we need to do. After a fire, that's when the soil is at its most fragile state. It's when, especially these larger trees are most needed by wildlife. So to go in there and tear up the soil, take out the bigger trees, because they're obviously not going in there for the small trees. That's not where the money is. These, they call them salvage logging. These salvage logging operations are just a disaster and really should not be allowed.
do you do any work around that issue, or is that?
Yeah, we do quite a bit of work on it. We've got a team, one team devoted to fighting it in the Sierra Nevada in California. We've got another team in Arizona, New Mexico, and then we've got another team that works in Oregon as well. So we're very much on top of that, and as these fires grow in intensity, that work keeps growing.
Good, thank you.
Other questions?
Yes, we do have some more questions here in the Q&A. A question from David. How are efforts to save the vaquita going?
Oh, that's a real heartbreaker. So the vaquita is a porpoise in the Gulf of California. In fact, it's the smallest porpoise in the world, very little fellow. And it is at dramatically low population levels, has been now for a number of years. And that's because it is being killed as a bycatch in other fisheries. The most important of those is an illegal fishery. It's a fish called the totoaba, also endangered, but at much higher levels. Fishing for it is illegal, but still occurs pretty broadly, and we put out nets for it at the mouths of estuaries in the northern Gulf of Mexico, and then it gets caught in the net and drowns. And meanwhile, the totoaba are captured or fished, killed, in order to sell their bladders on the international market to Chinese vendors, because they use it as a medicinal product. And they will spend a lot of money for those, up to $10,000 for a totoaba bladder. And that's a lot of money in northern Mexico. So the temptation to do this is very, very high. And then secondarily, you've got a shrimp trawling fishery. It's a legal fishery, but it's very significant as well. And it captures totoaba, not as many as the illegal fishery. That's still the biggest threat. So they've driven totoaba down to very, very low numbers. No one knows exactly sure, because there's so few and they're so hard to count in this big sea. But it's thought that they're down to 10 or less individuals, and a high-risk effort was tried last year to pen some of them up, essentially get them to swim into these very large coves and then close off the mouth of the cove. So it's kind of like they're captured, but they're captured in a large natural setting. To do this, to get them in an area that could be defended against the illegal fishing. And so it was a very risky operation, because there's reason to believe that the the vaquita would be very stressed by this. And when there's so few animals, you don't want to stress them. They can just die of stress. But there was also a feeling of desperation. We got to do something. So anyways, this was tried. And the very first time they did it, they could see that the vaquita were being highly stressed, and they abandoned the effort. So that Hail Mary pass did not work. Meanwhile, we've been putting a lot of pressure on the Mexican government to crack down on the illegal fishing. They have done so, at least to some extent, but not enough. It's a very, very difficult situation. So in fact, when we opened up our first non-US office, it was in La Paz, precisely to have someone dedicated to the vaquita battle. But it's still here. It's still here, but it's in a desperate plight, and there's not a clear path forward for obvious success for the species because the issue is so convoluted. So I wish I could report happier news on that.
It is really tragic. We're going to jump over to a question from Steve White that's been written in. Hey, Steve. So his question is, can the projected effects of climate change now be factored into ESA consideration for species?
Yeah, this is something we've been struggling with for years because the law should require that, and it essentially where that plays out is the law says you have to protect a species if it's endangered in the quote foreseeable future. So the question becomes, well, what is the foreseeable future? What does it mean to foresee it? And partly it's just a factual question of science. What does the science say? So, for example, with polar bears, it was very good government modeling of sea ice extent 100 years into the future. And it was very well established science. The polar bears need for sea ice was well established. And so in that decision, which was real groundbreaking, they used this 100+ year horizon to make that decision. Now, for other species, there simply hasn't been an investment of that level of funding in government agencies to do the modeling. So it's a bit less clear. And so you've got, on the one hand, this issue of, has the science been done? What can we say? But then on the other hand, very much in response to the polar bear being protected, Fish and Wildlife Service has proceeded to clamp down on the very concept of foreseeable future. And it's tried to come out with these very, very limited time periods. We just saw the other day, a species was denied protection because the agency said it won't go extinct in 25 years. That's the foreseeable future, 25 years. Well, from a species conservation history, a species that's occurred for 1 million years, 25 years is nothing. If you applied that to every species on the endangered species list, all 1,800, I think it'd be safe to say there's no threat that probably 95% of them are going to go extinct in 25 years. So if we use that threshold, we would remove protection from virtually every single endangered species because extinction is a long-term, slow process. I mean, look at the vaquita, for example. It's been down to tiny numbers, but it's been down to tiny numbers for a couple of decades. That's how extinction works. And so if you try to ignore what can the scientists see, what's the farthest they can see with their models and their data, and instead say, I'm going to set an arbitrary short time frame, that arbitrary time frame is going to exclude protection of everything. And that's exactly what happened under the Trump administration. And they issued a policy about how to define the foreseeable future. And to do it in a generic way across all species, when in fact the decision is entirely, or the ability to foresee the future is entirely contextually dependent on each and every species and what its habitat is and what its lifespan is, etc. So they, under Trump, really scaled that back. That's now been reversed. So that's good. But there's still not clear direction, and that's really what's needed about how to do this, and we're pushing for them to do it. And the way we want to approach it is don't use any generalized rule that doesn't make any sense. You just have to go species by species and see what the science says. And if you can foresee for a given species 50 years into the future, well, with climate change, do that. If you can foresee 200 years, do that. It's just simply do what the scientists say. But this is a huge issue, and it's one the agency is petrified of, because they rightfully see that climate change is a threat to an enormous number of species. It's not going to drive most of them extinct this year or next year or 10 years, but it will in the future. And the science is getting better at understanding that future. So they're running away from this in a cowardly, illegal way.
You know, when you talk about like just 10 members of a species being left, it's just so heartbreaking. It's literally like just one or two families of them, right?
Yeah.
What is that term for the last member of a species before it goes extinct? An endling, I think.
The
Is it an
endling,
endling?
yeah, an endling. The last member is
Just
the endling.
really gets you. Laura, do we have other questions?
We do. We have Doyle McClure. I'm going to go ahead and allow you to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. You can go ahead and unmute yourself on your Zoom. You're still with us, Doyle?
Oh yeah, this is Doyle McClure. Am I
Yes,
on?
go right
Hey,
ahead.
Doyle.
Hi. Hey, it's really good to hear your enlightened and learned summary of all the problems and what CBB is doing about it. Always grateful to know about that. We've communicated a couple of times about some of the problems here in Southwest Colorado, which are ongoing and enlarging, I think. So be sending some material in a few days, following up on some of those questions, particularly on water diversions, the fish issues, native fish in the Dolores River, and of course there's always oil and gas and agriculture, and both in the water diversion and in damage to the land with grazing. So again, really appreciate your informative talk. Thanks.
Well, I appreciate that, Doyle. Southern Colorado is an amazing place. You know, the valleys and mountains there are spectacular. Some of the best wilderness left. But as you say, it's under threat. You know, the water diversions, and of course, it's big oil and gas country. You know, I'm really hoping, especially with Biden endorsing the 30 by 30 campaign, that's to get 30% of the US land and water protected by 2030, that we can add a lot more protections in Southern Colorado.
Of course, with our gun packing lady representative, when the wolves come in, we're going to have even new issues for you.
Great, great. So do we have other questions?
We do have a question here from Mark Ashby. He's in Orinda, California. What is the state of protections for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the National Petroleum Reserve?
Yeah, so these are two adjacent, very large plots of land in the Arctic north coast of Alaska. And the oil and gas industry has been pushing hard to drill in them for many, many years. And we and others have been battling them. To date, we have been able to stop every permit that's been issued to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. But those battles are getting tougher and tougher. And there were big efforts during the Trump administration, which we were able to stymie. This has been a constant battle, as I said, for decades. And so one of the things we'd really like to see happen during the Biden administration is they just get permanently and fully taken off the table as a place for oil and gas drilling. And you'd start with the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's the most obvious, it's a wildlife refuge. But the Arctic Petroleum Reserve, it's a petroleum reserve, right? It's not a wildlife reserve. So that's a tougher fight, but it's just as important, just as valuable habitat as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So we need to take that fight on and will it as well, and especially not compromise. There have been efforts in the past to say, well, if we give up this amount of the refuge, then you can protect that other part. And we believe that the entire thing should be protected because not only is it critical protecting the land, but if we can keep the oil and gas infrastructure that occurs in Alaska now, the offshore stuff, very small, keep the industrial footprint limited. So it's not like the Gulf of Mexico. They will not have enough momentum and political strength to keep going. You know, if you go to the Gulf of Mexico now and say, okay, let's stop oil drilling here, people are like, you know, the whole infrastructure of the region is based on this oil drilling. That's not the case in Alaska yet at all. So if you open a door to one area and say, well, okay, go here because we'll protect this other area, you're undermining yourself in the long term because you're allowing industrial development that's extremely, virtually impossible to undevelop. And it gets them a nose under the tent to push for more and more. So at any rate, there's going to be a big push here during the Biden administration to get full protection for them on a political level, and hopefully we can be successful. So additional questions?
Yes, we have a question from Pat Brown. Is there a possibility of any jaguar corridor from Mexico to the proposed protection habitat in New Mexico, Silver City, and Arizona?
Yeah, so in Arizona, we've got jaguar critical habitat designated. So these, corridors are drawn out specifically to encourage and help jaguars move from Mexico into the US. And then once they're in the US, to move between mountain ranges. So good work's been done there already. They don't connect up that explicitly into New Mexico, but we have, a large system of national forests and BLM areas in place already. And the jaguars are quite mobile. So I think that if we can get a population established, there's definitely enough connectivity in place, protected lands of different kinds for the jaguars to move around. That was part of the study that we put together and published earlier this year, was looking at questions like that. What's the road density? What's the human population density, et cetera? Is this sufficient to allow jaguar movement? And it's there. The jaguar can definitely survive as a breeding population if they're given a chance. So with that, I think we should call it a day here. And I want to thank everybody for coming on, for sticking with us through this whole COVID period, which has been very challenging for us all. Encourage you to keep supporting us and getting involved and helping out here as we move into the Biden era, because we've still got a tremendous amount of work to do, and you wouldn't be able to do it without your support. So thank you for that, and we'll be talking to you more throughout the year.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. That was Kieran Suckling, our executive director, and I'm Paula Simmons with our great team here from the Center for Biological Diversity. Thanks so much, Kieran, for briefing all of our Leadership Circle and Owls Club members on our tireless work to protect species great and small. And to all of our listeners, thanks for your excellent questions. We really appreciate everybody being on the call, and your support makes what we do possible. We can't do it without you, so thanks again. Final reminder, we'll be emailing you an audio recording real soon, and we'll also have a transcript of the call available upon request. In the interim, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us with any questions at all. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Bye now.